Another attack on the media in Israel. The Benjamin Netanyahu government greenlights a plan to sanction the country's oldest newspaper. Haaretz is accused of hurting the state through its critical coverage of the war on Gaza. So what does this mean for press freedom in Israel? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. When Al Jazeera was banned in September, the network's bureau chief criticised Benjamin Netanyahu, saying he wants only his voice to be heard. Now, Walid Omari's warning is fast becoming reality. As well as foreign media outlets in Israel, those inside the country that are critical of the Israeli Prime Minister are facing a crackdown. The Cabinet has approved a proposal to cut all government links with Haaretz, a move that could cripple the 105-year-old newspaper financially and force it to shut down. Haaretz has condemned the action, calling it another step in Netanyahu's journey to dismantle Israeli democracy. So can a free press survive in Israel? And can Israel's Western allies pressure it to respect democratic values they stand for? We will talk about these issues a bit later on. But first, this report by Fintan Monahan.
The Israeli government is taking aim at the country's oldest newspaper. It's sanctioning Haaretz by preventing any state-funded body from communicating with its journalists or placing ads on its platforms. The actions come after its publisher criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's administration at a conference in London.
The Netanyahu government wants to continue and intensify illegal settlement in the territories that were meant for a Palestinian state. It doesn't care about imposing a cruel apartheid regime on the Palestinian population. It dismisses the costs of both sides for defending the settlements while fighting the Palestinian freedom fighter that Israel calls terrorists.
Shalkin later said he was not referring to Hamas as freedom fighters, but the controversy was enough to spark a renewed campaign against the paper. The Israeli cabinet unanimously approved to sanction Haaretz, accusing the newspaper of supporting terrorism and hurting the legitimacy of the Israeli state. Haaretz has condemned the move as an attack on Israeli democracy. The publication is one of the leading media outlets in Israel, willing to challenge the government's narrative on the war on Gaza and criticize its policy.
Almost all the media outlets totally recruited themselves to the narrative of the government and the army and avoided the Israelis foreseeing Gaza, avoided Israel foreseeing the crimes in Gaza, and pleased or did anything possible to please the viewers and readership, while Haaretz tried to stick to the truth and to the full truth.
Israel's war on Gaza has led to a crackdown on both domestic and international media. Analysts warn that its campaign against Haaretz may have only just begun.
What they're trying to do is put the Haaretz out of business. Now, if they're unsuccessful, they're likely to consider other measures as the criticism goes on, because what they're really trying to do is shoot the messenger.
Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians, sparking condemnation from around the world. The government's response has been to attempt to control the narrative and silence dissenting voices, policies that may lead to the truth in Israel becoming another casualty of war. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. In Tel Aviv is Akiva Alder, who is a former Haaretz editorial board member and former United States bureau chief. In London, Tim Dawson is the Deputy Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists. And also in Tel Aviv, Dan Perry is the former chair of the Foreign Press Association of Israel and a former regional editor of the Associated Press news agency in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Thank you so much for being with us. A really important topic to discuss here. Dan, if I can start with you. The Israeli government has accused Haaretz of supporting terrorism and undermining the Israeli state. Do you believe that that is what the media outlet has done?
Well, of course not. Obviously not. Haaretz simply is the most clear voice of journalistic opposition to the government of Netanyahu. And it is about more than just the particular conduct of the war in Gaza, the essence of which, by the way, the Haaretz editorial team mostly supports. The particularities are something else. Haaretz has been critical of everything about the Netanyahu coalition, including the year or so that they were trying to essentially Putinize the country before the war even began, a time during which the security chiefs of Israel had warned Netanyahu that the schism they were creating would invite attack and bring about the war, and they were, of course, ignored. Haaretz is simply an opposition newspaper, and the government of Netanyahu is akin to their illiberal equivalents in places like Hungary, in a worst case, even Turkey. Not entirely unlike, the Russia regime under Putin 20 years ago when they were merely authoritarian and not yet fully dictatorial. As such, they try to portray the critical media as somehow enemies of the people, enemies of the state. They're going to try to fight it. And when a person like Amos Shokin goes a bit too far and says things and uses vocabulary that I'm sure he now regrets, they pretend to be shocked, but in fact they're happy because it helps them to delegitimize critical voices in the press.
Akiva, as Dan outlined there, Haaretz has been long critical of this coalition government. But can you explain why the statement in particular about the Palestinian freedom fighters, why that provoked these government sanctions?
Actually, it's just a pretext. This project to destroy Haaretz, as well as the rest of the free media, including television who are mainstream channels like Channel 13 that is once in a while criticizing the government. What Netanyahu has in mind is to shut down every critical voice and portray it, as Perry mentioned, as the enemy of Israel. If you disagree, not just with the government, with Netanyahu, the persona, and with his policy, you are not legitimate. And the line that was criticized of Amos Shokin, which he regretted, and he explained that he didn't mean the Hamas when he was talking about freedom fighters. He was referring to Abu Mazen and to the Palestinian Authority. But keep in mind that the idea to close down Haaretz by stopping to advertise and to sign, for government workers, the prescription for Haaretz, this was lying in the drawer for more than a year. The Minister of Communication, who now initiated this project, this campaign against Haaretz, was on record talking about an embargo campaign to close down Haaretz, and actually Amos Shokin unfortunately played right into his hands.
Okay, Tim, can you just explain to us what the sanctions are actually going to mean for Haaretz? How will this affect them both editorially and financially, do you think?
Well, I can only base my understanding on what I've read, but most legacy media rely quite heavily on advertising and other support that comes from governments, and taking that away will remove a significant plank of the economic model on which they're based, being demonized also by the state, whose populace you seek to serve, is a serious means of undermining a newspaper. I mean, clearly, it's a newspaper that has plenty of enemies within Israel, but from my perspective, criticism of a government, criticism of politicians is something that makes democracy stronger and makes democracy work. We don't all agree. We have different perspectives. We have different outlooks. And it is far better for society that those are aired in a free and fair way. So, I mean, to be honest, this slide into trying to control extraordinarily tightly the media is a really dangerous one for Israel, and one that actually weakens Israel, in my view. And I think those people who are sucked into being cheerleaders for Netanyahu should really think hard about what they're supporting and the damage that this will do to Israeli society, actually at a time when it needs to be as strong as possible, and allowing divergent voices, particularly in a country where there are so many divergent opinions, I think is really important. And allowing those to flow free is what makes society work, rather than making it a narrow and actually rather more fragile body.
Yeah, Dan, do you think that this move, these sanctions, weakens Israel, like Tim was saying there? Haaretz has denounced the action, saying it's an attack on democracy. Many others have said the same. Is that how you see it?
Oh, absolutely. But it's no surprise. As I said before, this particular government is the spiritual kin of other governments across the world that are democratically elected, but believe in a version of democracy that is purely about essentially dictatorship of the majority. They are no fans of the trappings of liberal democracy that include many, many things, including the right of the minority, the right of the political minority to speak its mind. Now, they're not going to ban Haaretz. They're trying to do it damage, and also they're trying to sort of circle the wagons of their own constituents and sort of project to them that they're doing something that is part and parcel of the cultural war, essentially, far, far broader than the issue of the Palestinians. And look, I mean, the noises they're making about the enemies of the state, I mean, this is stuff that you hear also from the Trumpist crowd in the U.S. This is a movement of the populist right around the world, and the Netanyahu government is one of the leading lights of that movement. Will it really harm Haaretz? I'm not so sure. I don't have the data on their revenue, but one should remember that this is one of the world's relatively few papers that is very successful with its paywall, and they charge a lot of money. I mean, it's a fairly small number of global legacy newspapers that can do this, and we're talking about the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Financial Times. Haaretz is in that zone, and I would not be at all surprised if this war on their revenue, on the advertising side of the revenue, backfires, because I know plenty of people who, for example, have a weekly subscription to Haaretz, and that includes myself, who are now considering making it daily, even though they really don't need the daily printout. They're going to do that just to make a point.
Akiva, just on that, can you just give us a sense of what the reaction has been from the people of Israel, but also the other Israeli media outlets that might be considered more mainstream? Have they spoken out against this move?
Well, I would like to see more of my colleagues to show sympathy and to take steps against this government, to be more active. I said when Haaretz was the only newspaper that protested against the steps that were taken against Al Jazeera. There was no other media agency that said a word about closing down the offices of our colleagues from Al Jazeera. And it's like Martin Omer said after World War II, that when they came for the communist, I wasn't there for them because I was not a communist. When they came for the Jews, I wasn't there. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. But when they came for me, there was nobody left. And I am afraid that Haaretz is not the last one. As I said, they are after any media outlet that does not play along the lines of the government. That, I wrote an article in Haaretz, and I don't see any other media outlet in Israel that would let me do this, that I called to disinvite Israel from the Olympic Games. Haaretz published 2 weeks ago and a column by a settler that called to fire the publisher, Amos Shokin. And Israel is shooting itself in the legs because for many years, Haaretz was a kind of a window to show that Israel is the only democracy in the world, that Haaretz is a free newspaper that attacks the government, and still the government is paying for advertisement and buys subscription for officials and ministers, everybody is reading Haaretz and paying for it. And now what the world is seeing is that Israel is not even pretending to be a democracy. It's a formal democracy. It's a kind of Hungarian, so to speak, democracy. It's the end. It's a slippery slope. It started with Al Jazeera. It's now Haaretz, and there will be more.
Well, just on that point, Akiva, press freedom in Israel has worsened since Israel launched its war on Gaza in October last year. Now, the Netanyahu government shut down Al Jazeera's operations in the country in September, using a new law that allows it to ban international news outlets seen as a threat to national security. A month later, equipment used by the Associated Press was confiscated for providing live video feeds to Al Jazeera. Now, Israel has severely restricted international media's reporting of the genocide in Gaza. Very few journalists have been given access. Those who have are embedded with the Israeli military and operate under heavy restrictions. Now, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 74 have been arrested across Gaza, the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem since October last year. It says more than 100 Palestinian journalists have been killed in the last 13 months, along with 2 Israeli and 3 Lebanese reporters. Tim, if I can go to you next. I mean, when you hear and see those numbers, what do you make of that? I mean, I understand that your organisation has calculated that something like 10% of Gaza's journalists have been killed.
It's an utterly awful situation. I mean, everything that you say is right. The locking out of the international media, the harassment of news platforms such as Al Jazeera and those who have provided coverage for it. But the most awful, the most dreadful aspect of this is the extraordinary body count among Gaza's journalists. There were something like 1,000 at work at the outset of this conflict, and numbers vary, but well over 100 have lost their lives. That's a mortality rate, much, much higher than the general population, 3 times higher than medical professionals, more than double the kind of mortality rate you would expect of combat troops in the most challenging military circumstances. Now, we don't have all the facts about why the death toll has been so high, but the anecdotal evidence that it's been based on deliberate targeting is very strong indeed. I mean, we saw an investigation only this week in the Guardian newspaper of the death of 3 media workers in Lebanon right at the outset of this conflict, which is a further suggestion that it was based on intelligence and on a deliberate action. This, if proven to be true, is the most atrocious war crime I can really imagine, and an assault on the media of a kind that we have never seen before. My hope is that it can all be tested judicially. Perhaps contained within the IDF, there is strong evidence that refutes these claims. So many of the missiles and bombs and so on are computer guided. So there is going to be, huge data files of how these decisions or how people came to be killed. I hope against hope, for everybody's sake, that a proper investigation can take place and that the world can really get to the bottom of what has happened here. But it does create a picture of an assault on media freedom and an assault on the world's ability to know what's going on that is really without precedent. And I suppose one has to pay tribute to the journalists in Gaza who've continued working despite this assault and despite having lost so many of their friends and colleagues.
Yeah, Dan, it's not just the targeting of journalists, but the way that the Israeli military and government controls their access to Gaza. As we mentioned before, it uses this to restrict the movements of journalists. Many international news outlets have criticised this, saying that they don't get a fair understanding, a true understanding of what is happening in Gaza. I mean, how successful has the Israeli military been, though, in trying to control that narrative of exactly what is happening in Gaza on the international stage, do you think?
Well, not very successful at all, because it tends to backfire, leaving the door wide open for merely the perspective of people in Gaza, many of whom may actually be propagandists. It's very foolish. The Foreign Press Association in Israel has actually appealed, and I've discussed this on other media on numerous occasions. They've appealed this basically near blanket ban on foreign journalists being allowed into Gaza. It's complex because, of course, the security argument is not spurious. It's incredibly dangerous, and the last thing they want is even more people killed because they were allowed into a war zone. Look, I am not a person who thinks that Israel targets journalists because they're journalists. There's a number of arguments to the contrary. One says basically that many of these journalists are not really journalists, but something entirely different, posing as journalists. Another argument says that pure Hamas sometimes drive around in press trucks. Now, I can't prove or disprove it, but I certainly know they're not above it. A third issue is when we talk about the huge number of journalists, of course, the definition of a journalist has been changed dramatically in the past 10 years or so with social media. My two daughters can claim to be journalists. I mean, everyone's posting everything all the time, and that may affect the large numbers as well. Putting aside the fact that the death toll in Gaza has just been horrific. So the numbers are so high, or at least if the numbers that are reported that Israel doesn't deny are so high, then people of every profession are going to be killed just as a random sample. It's a horrifying situation. I'm not sure there's a very clear case of right and wrong. Certainly, Israel should be projecting less indifference to it. The fact that it appears that something horrible may be happening is something that they should treat at the very least, beyond the morality of it, as a public relations emergency. And of course, they're not. And that has to do not with the military, but with this government that is not just incompetent on public diplomacy, but as I say, part of an authoritarian global cabal that is not friendly to journalism in general.
Yeah, Dan, some of the talking, some of what you were saying there, accusing Hamas of using press vans to drive around, those are simple talking points that we've heard many times from the Israeli military and the government, and to this point have not been proven at all. And we know that many of our Al Jazeera colleagues have been killed doing the best they can, given the circumstances, and doing incredibly brave work. And they are legitimate journalists. They're not just social media campaigners with their iPhone out.
And of course, legitimate journalists in Gaza are to be praised and to be admired, no doubt about it. I'm just saying it's a complex picture.
Indeed. Yeah, it is an incredibly complex picture. I don't think anyone's going to argue at that point. Akiva, can I come to you now? And I mean, because obviously this is much wider than Haaretz. Al Jazeera has been closed down in Israel, the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem. I mean, what sort of message does that send to the other media outlets in Israel? And how do you think that has affected some of its coverage, how it deals with the coalition government?
Unfortunately, Haaretz is the only media outlet that is not exclusively motivated by rating and by the number of advertisements that are bought by the government and the private sector. But what I saw today, which is interesting, that in less than 24 hours, NGO, which is part of the protest against the judicial coup d'etat, has raised in less than 24 hours 100,000 shekels from thousands of people that donated 50 shekels, 100 shekels to buy front page advertising, and it will go on every day. And they publish all kind of fake news and incitements, quotes from ministers, from Channel 14. We didn't mention this. This is the official Pravda outlet. This is a channel that is actually the voice of Netanyahu, not the voice of the Likud, not the voice of the government. It's a private outlet of Netanyahu, which is busy inciting everyone who disagrees with Haaretz. And they actually do a daily campaign against every media outlet that is not following the line. Their main show is called The Patriots. They are the patriots, and Haaretz are the journalists like Gideon Levy, like Amira Haas, who are telling the truth. And it's very important to mention. I was a member of the editorial board, and I wrote hundreds of editorials. And the common line was that Haaretz is a Zionist newspaper. And this is not taken for granted by many writers in Haaretz. And this was the line of the editorial board for 35 years that I have been there, and this is still the line. They criticize the government, they criticize the policy, but Haaretz is calling for a two-state solution along the 67 lines. Okay. And now this became kind of the opposite of the narrative, and it became the opposition not only to the government, to Zionism. Because once you have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich sitting in the cabinet and deciding to close down Haaretz, I think that this is something that if you would have told me this 10 years ago, I would ask you what kind of drugs you're taking.
We keep talking about, guys, we keep talking about closing down Haaretz. That is not what's currently happening. They're trying to harm Haaretz, and they're doing it in a way that is, I believe, illegitimate, in a way that confuses the state with the government. Companies that are funded by the state are not owned by the government, and they're crossing that line. Interestingly, perhaps the most the media organ in Israel that is most credited with being a little bit like Haaretz on the broadcast side is Channel 11, which is the state broadcaster, a little bit analogous to BBC. So it is no surprise that the same communication minister, Kari, mentioned earlier in this program, is also targeting the state broadcaster, looking for ways to privatize them, and maybe down the road, if no buyer is found, no billionaire friend of Netanyahu buyer is found, maybe to shut them down. It's not quite as ham-fisted as Erdogan would do it, shutting them down tomorrow. But they're certainly at war with critical media.
Okay, Tim, I just want to finish with a question that we asked at the very beginning. How can a free press survive in Israel?
I think the evidence of journalists throughout the region is that they are very determined, dedicated workers who commit themselves. I mean, it's not a particularly well-paid profession. It's quite a dangerous one. Journalists themselves commit to trying their very hardest to get the truth out. And I have faith that journalists will continue to find ways to do that. I hope against hope that Haaretz is not closed down. But even if it were, I feel certain that people with the skills of journalists and a critical frame of mind would continue to find ways to get news out, and to hope that a point will come where the Israeli government is able to embrace a free, liberal, diverse media that reflects all the many opinions in that country.
Indeed. OK, we'll have to leave it there, but we really do appreciate your insight. Akiva, Tim and Dan, thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X and Instagram. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.